Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this episode of Defense News Weekly, highlights from the 20th annual C4ISRNet conference. Find out what industry and military leaders think about topics like the future of electronic warfare, conflict in space, and other related arenas. Also, the next installment of our limited series on one of the most hair-raising occupations in the Vietnam War, long-range reconnaissance patrols. Learn about how these elite soldiers were trained to operate behind enemy lines. And a new series on some of the little-known history of Black service members debuts on National Geographic. We talk to the narrator on the project, the one and only Idris Elba. It's the latest in news and analysis, from the Pentagon to the platoon, here on Defense News Weekly. Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Pat Hansen. The conflicts of today and the near future are going to be won and lost on not just the backs of service members in the trenches, but by those fighting the war for information. Command and control, electronic warfare, and networked forces are all integral in a modern war. The one who wins will be the one who can handle the massive amounts of data acquired by each in a logical and secure way, or prevent their adversary from doing so. With that in mind, for this year's C4ISRNet conference, the 20th iteration of the annual event, we gathered a host of high-level military and industry leaders to talk about topics in this space. Here's a look at some of the highlights of the event. First up, a panel on the future of electronic warfare. Check it out.
The United States has obviously been paying close attention to the conflict in Ukraine over the last 2.5 years and the conflict between Israel and Hamas. And electronic warfare plays a role clearly in both those conflicts. What lessons on the role that EW plays in modern warfare has the Pentagon learned from observing what's going on in Ukraine and the Middle East? And how does it differ for a military that faces a modern force like Russia's versus lower tech militant groups such as Hamas?
Yeah, I'll start. I think the biggest takeaway is that our near peer adversaries, and then elements like Hamas, they do have formidable EW capabilities, right? And so we have to just be prepared to have to expect that we're going to operate in a contested, congested, and then even a denied EMS environment. So we have to plan for our sensors to be able to operate in those conditions. And it gets back to the kind of layered approach, but it's also, understanding adversary TTPs. And we also have to realize that it cannot just be the material solution, right? It has to be across the .mil PF when it comes to, training, TTPs, things along those lines. And in the end, it's really about making sure that our systems, our soldiers, and our commanders have that kind of freedom of maneuver within the EMS, and making sure we're denying that adversary that same. And you have to look at it across all three portions from an EW standpoint: electronic support, electronic protect, and electronic attack, right? As we kind of look at that, we also have to ensure that from an acquisition standpoint on our side of the house, making sure that we're agile enough to be able to adapt, as threats emerge, to maintain pace with the threat. But then we have to expand that out too, right? It can't just, like I said, it can't be just a material solution. It's how we're informing the rest of the institution to do the things they need to do, like training, as an example. And it goes back to that agility. We call it organizational agility in my PEO, making sure we're prepared to pivot to whatever's thrown at us. Because you're right. Adversaries, you're seeing it in Ukraine or in Europe with the Houthis. The implementation of what I characterize it as sometimes as non-exquisite capabilities in mass against exquisite capabilities, and sometimes that mask can be quite overwhelming. So we have to be able to understand that, how they're acquiring things. I mean, a lot of it's cheap, a lot of it's attritable, and then so it's how we adjust across our battle space and across our TTPs, and how we fight, how our con ops. So it's just one of those things that, from an Army standpoint, we're just looking at it differently. I mean, we're realizing we have to build essentially an EW arsenal across the landscape to be able to go at these different types of threats.
Yeah, outstanding. And the only pylons I'd add there is from my catbird seat is that, we're in the spectrum. We're in an area of perpetual novelty, and our adversaries are going to be able to move and change and be agile on the spectrum just as much as we are. And so that really drives us, in my view, is three really critical pieces. The first one is interoperability amongst our weapon systems. They have to be able to talk to each other. And so if we fight a near peer tonight, we're going to fight with the capabilities we have today. And so how do we make the systems that we have today more interoperable and able to share information?
Next up from this year's C4ISRNet conference, a conversation on keeping up with the military's cyber needs. Is the US infrastructure good enough to handle the Pentagon's massive appetite for data? Our panelists weighed in.
As you look at how the military is operating now, or plans to operate, for instance, the Army wants to be highly mobile, dynamic, distributed at the tactical edge, but it wants to have an abundance of data at its fingertips, and in order to make rapid decisions at lower echelons. And we're seeing this play out in units like the Multi-Domain Task Force, for instance. So what challenges does this create for data management and for cybersecurity? And I'll turn that over to if Mr. Wynn wants to talk about this, or Colonel to start, and then we'll go with Mr. Bishop if he has any thoughts to follow.
All right, Jen, I'll go ahead.
We'll go with Colonel.
I'll go ahead. I didn't hear anybody chime up, but too easy. So valid question. So for the electromagnetic warfare specifically, the challenge we have with data and the echelons really comes into the overclassification. We've traditionally collected the data within the SIGINT production chain, meaning it was already classified in writing Title 50 infrastructure, and the commanders in contact, when we look at rapidly moving and potentially isolated forces, won't have that connectivity real time all the way back to the strategic base that we came to know and love through the last 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, where all of that capability was really piped all the way forward and back from the NSA main to the tactical edge. So as we look at how we re-envision the data, the classification, and versus the data security, when we talk about the data we really need at ingest, it comes down to how do we take the data off a sensor, bifurcate it so that the SIGINT and the intelligence professionals get the data they need, while the command also gets the data they need to retain locally, and how do we make sure that that data is available without being overclassified? What we don't really have right now is a data classification guidance from a policy perspective that guides that data all the way to the tactical edge and all the way back, so that we understand as we carry that data forward, how it's secured, what means it's riding on, and how we look at the Title 50 versus Title 10. Those are some of the harder challenges. But as we look at these, we'll talk more about the compute and how we think about through these mission sets later. We'll get into that as well. Mr. Wynn?
Hey, thank you, Colonel Brock. So before this, so I've only been in this job for about a year. Prior to this, I spent about 2.5 years with Marfor Cyber as the tech director. So very involved with thinking through, expeditionary cyber, how do we defend the data forward and so on, and then how do we enable the stand-in force for the Marine Corps and so on. So spent a lot of time thinking through this. So my mental model, my mental framework, and when I think of this is I broke out to 3 areas. So applications, data, and then transport. Right, those 3 things need to be think through together to then identify the way ahead. So, for example, at the edge, from a cybersecurity perspective, in a potential DDoS environment, what set of applications do I need, and what kind of functions do I need for those applications? And then, based on that, what data do I need to perform that functions that I need from those applications? And then, from a censoring perspective, what are the data from the different platforms or wherever else in that local network that needs to be fed to my system, right, locally. And then based on my transport available, how much of that data can I send back? Or how much do I need to process forward with the local data until I have a more robust bandwidth or transport to handle back? So those three areas from a application, data, and transport are the 3 points of a triangle where I try to balance in doing the analysis based on the mission needs, right? So what we were doing in the Marine Corps and same with the Army is moving a lot of our big data platform and software out to the edge with a local platform to enable local processing and whatever else, and then identifying a subset of data that needs to be sent back to the hire, then identifying the transport to move that critical data that needs to be sent back. And then the other piece, the last piece I would say is we also identify, when we build the analytics up in the cloud and whatever else, we also try to account for the limited processing that would be available at the edge to be able to conduct those analytics. So those are the things we were thinking about.
When we return, the latest from our new series on Vietnam, Shadows in the Jungle. Learn how long-range recon soldiers learn to operate behind enemy lines. Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. In the 1960s in Vietnam, the Army was trying all the time to adapt to fight a determined guerrilla enemy in dense jungle. One outgrowth of that effort was the establishment of long-range reconnaissance patrol units, small teams of 6 soldiers sent deep behind enemy lines to gather intelligence on enemy positions and numbers. With such a specialized skill set and incredibly high level of danger, there must have been a comprehensive training regimen for soldiers before heading out into enemy territory, right? Not exactly. In part 2 of our limited series, Shadows in the Jungle, we learn about how these troops got prepared to take on the enemy on their own turf.
All of our missions, military intelligence begged for prisoners, live prisoners. My team leader stepped out in front of a lone VC coming down the trail. And Dong Lai means halt in Vietnamese. And he told him Dong Lai. The guy did an about face and took off running. And he ran about 10 yards and turned left, right into me and my partner. And team leader yelled out, "Kill him." And so we did.
That was your first contact with the enemy?
Right.
Yeah, you have to realize that when the alert companies were originally formed, they put out the call for experienced people throughout all the units that were in Vietnam to form these companies. So all the guys in the company were a lot older than I was. I was a replacement coming in late. And a lot of the guys started looking out for me because I was the kid. I was only 18 years old.
I think the ROTC I had in college, and I think being older than a lot of those guys helped me too. I was 20 when I went to Nam, so I turned 21 in Nam. Most of those guys were 18 and 19. So I think the maturity level helped me in leadership more than the experience did.
To be honest with you, I personally didn't get any training when I went to the LERPs. They were looking for team leaders, people that had, and I had my previous tour, they just absolutely select me. Now I went out and worked with my team. We didn't get fancy. I think later on they came out, they put some rappelling towers out. I mean, we rappelled and we worked with and McGuire rig extractions, but it was just more OJT than anything in those early years. I mean, it was just like, you have to figure it out. No book, no, you know. But the people that got, if you want to call it training, actually went to the Recondo School, and they learned a lot about that. But as far as me, I mean, I walked into the unit and they said, okay, there's your team, go get them.
In the first place, when the day that you get to Vietnam, you get a certain level of adrenaline that stays in your body the whole time you're there, because you don't know who's the enemy, when you're going to get hit, and you're always, that apprehension is in the back of your head, and you're always on alert.
The adrenaline rush caused guys to do strange things, laugh, idiotically, you know. It was not comparable to anything else in life. Better than sex. One guy eventually ended up being our team leader. His first mission, we got into a really hairy situation. We got surrounded. And as the helicopter's lifting off, I'm singing a song from the Dave Clark 5. It starts out, "Here we come again, catch us if you can." And then the next verse is, "Now we gotta run, no more time for fun." And he thought I'd gone crazy, but maybe I did.
The bottom line, when you volunteer for a company like that, and this goes with Special Forces and with the Rangers and with the LRPs, if you decide that you can't handle it, you just raise your hand and say, "I quit." And nothing said. You know, you don't get called anything or anything else like that. They just cut your set of orders and you walk off and go.
I've never quit anything in my life. So if you're not going to quit, you better get good.
And we spent almost a month just doing quick reaction drills up and down the company streets, to basically more training before we even went out on a mission.
I had some doubts, and I think as a young man of 20 years old, you have doubts and you rise to the occasion. And like John Wayne says, you know, being afraid and saddling up anyways, it's kind of that kind of mentality. And I got through the first night. There was a time when I remember they taught us how to do tracheotomies with a ballpoint pen. And they taught us how to give blood units, and we carried atropine syrettes, we carried morphine syrettes. We kind of learned how to, when we went to training, do the medical stuff. And I remember they had a body of VC that had been killed. They were getting ready to transport, and they showed how to do a tracheotomy on it. And I had never seen a dead body, you know, at 20 years old. And I remember the first sergeant put his hand on my shoulder. He said, "You'll get used to it."
Shadows in the Jungle will continue running on militarytimes.com throughout June. When we come back, our personal finance expert returns with a primer on savings accounts. Don't go away. Welcome back. Savings accounts are really simple, right? On this edition of Money Minute, personal finance expert Jeanette Mack explains some of the differences in the various types of these accounts you might encounter.
As savings rates rise, where you keep your money becomes increasingly important. To make the most of your hard-earned dollars, get savvy about interest rates and savings accounts. Start by exploring the big three: traditional savings accounts, money market savings, and certificates of deposit, or CDs. Traditional savings accounts are great if you're just starting out, building emergency savings, or for short and long-term savings goals, because the funds are always accessible without penalty. Money market savings accounts offer higher interest rates in return for the higher balance you'll have to maintain in the account, and withdrawals are penalty-free. CDs offer the highest rates of the three, which is great. You just have to be sure you won't need access to that money for the set term on the account. CD terms range from a year to 10 years or more. Go with one or all three of these accounts. The important thing is to save. You work hard for your money. Make sure your money is working hard for you.
Thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next week. To get more coverage of military and defense topics, pilot your aircraft carrier towards militarytimes.com or defensenews.com for more headlines. And to become the most up-to-date mortarman in the squad, sign up for our early bird brief, compiled each morning to bring you the most recent headlines. Lastly, if social media is where you grab open source intelligence, follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and X, formerly known as Twitter. And while it's still legal, we're on TikTok, so go find us there as well. When we come back, we talk to actor Idris Elba about a new series focused on the little-discussed accomplishments of service members of color during the Second World War. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Pat Hansen. The history of service members of color during World War II is often little explored. Now, a new show from National Geographic called Erased: World War II's Heroes of Color dives into the topic in a series that debuted just before the 80th anniversary of D-Day. We spoke to the director of the project, as well as the show's narrator, actor Idris Elba, about the importance of telling these stories.
My father joined the Navy, and he ended up in Pearl Harbor.
They made all these sacrifices to build a better world.
You can't say I didn't fight to smash the fascist mind.
So for many men of this generation, silence was the standard. When you couple that silence with the suppression of Black contributions in World War II, how difficult was it to shape and tell these stories? And how important was it for both of you that the story of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion be told?
So I think the story of D-Day, especially with our Black soldiers, you know, it was a story that was very much silenced. And one of the historians that I interviewed, called Linda Herview, she had gone on a journey to interview hundreds of the men who were still alive, who served in the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. And I think the trauma of D-Day and what these men experiences was pretty traumatic. You know, war is brutal and gruesome. They were seeing body parts torn apart in front of them. And we've got to remember, these are young men, boys. They're 17, 18, 19 years old. And I think when they came home, there was a grief and a trauma that they had to deal with. And it was at a time where obviously we weren't talking about mental health. You just kind of had to get on with it. And I think that was what happened with a lot of these men. I think they parked it and got on with their life. They had to provide for their families. They had to, you know, be strong. They had to fight discrimination. And the last thing I think a lot of them had on their minds was being a celebrated war hero. They did what they felt they had to do. It was their duty to do so. And they felt patriotic. And I think that's why this story is really important to retell, is because they deserve that celebration and that thanks. And it's something that a lot of these men died not having and not getting a thank you. This is 3 stories out of over 1,000 men who were there, and not to even mention the Labour troops and the men who were, you know, risking their lives without any weapons, without any ammunition. They were extremely vulnerable, and they were running back and forth, unloading the ships, bringing new supplies. And again, their stories haven't really been told in such a detailed way.
If there's any genre of film, you know, books, fiction, you know, news clippings that isn't silent, it's the war stories, okay? And, you know, World War II has been very well told, but it's irony, the irony is here in this situation that this particular set of stories, this particular set of perspective has not been told. And so it doesn't quite fit to be silent when it's silent about one specific set of people, soldiers, contributors, you know, when the rest of the war, the stories have been glorified in such a biased way.
It was a lovely 4-part series, and I really appreciate you guys telling this story. As a military historian, I honestly hadn't known about Black soldiers on D-Day, and that comes through like one of the archivists were like, who are our historians and archivists who don't know this and aren't telling this story? And I'm certainly one of them. So it was very enlightening. So I appreciate you both bringing that to light.
Thank you, Claire. That means a lot. It really does. I think that this story, these stories are about opening that perspective up. You know, war isn't pretty. It isn't a happy place. And, you know, I don't stand here sort of basking in glory about telling these stories because they're horrible stories. But it is about education. It is about perspective. So thank you for sharing that.
And that's all we have time for in this episode. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.